In the modern day, many people have fallen into the error of relativism, where moral or ethical principles are completely dependent and relative on the individual person. They may even go as far as saying that there are no true moral obligations, and that mankind is left to do with whatever he wants or desires. As Pope Gregory XVI writes, "Thus, by institutions, and by the example of teachers, the minds of the youth are corrupted, and a tremendous blow is dealt to religion, and the perversion of morals is spread." This perverse notion that is taught by many in today's society is itself an evil, and it is contrary to the truth that there is in actuality an objective morality or system of ethics that we can come to know. This objective morality is none other than the natural law, that has its intellectual beginnings in that of Aristotle, and then was later formulated with perfection by that of St Thomas Aquinas and the rest of the scholastic tradition. As a side note, if you want to support me, make sure to check out my store, which has various graphics related to Christ, St. Thomas, St. Augustine, and more. Thank you. Natural law theory begins with the idea of order, and not merely a perceived order that we conjure up, but an ontological order. Essentially, natural law begins with the claim that in the universe, each and every thing has an objective order or purpose. Within the system of Aristotle and St. Thomas, this purpose that is instilled within everything that exists is called the principle of finality. This principle of finality teaches that all things have certain final ends or goals that they are directed toward. The final end of the heart is to pump blood. The final end of an eye is to see visual sense information. The final end of a tree is to produce oxygen. Another way of looking at the idea of final ends is to look at the nature or essence of a thing. For the final end of the mouth is to consume food and drink liquids, and the mouth is determined or constructed in such a way as to achieve this end. This principle of finality is a self-evident principle. That is to say, it is true in itself and does not require a syllogism or argument to prove it. Although it cannot be directly argued for, it can be indirectly shown to be true by refuting any opposition to it. Thus, the opposing interlocutor would have to accept impossible consequences that result from denying the principle of finality, for they would have to say that there is no purpose or meaning, or that the eye is not for seeing, nor even the mind for thinking, since supposedly such a principle doesn't exist. But then the interlocutor would have to submit their argument, for if the mind is not ordered towards thinking, then thinking is not ordered towards truth. Essentially, in order for the interlocutor's argument to hold ground, they would have to use the principle of finality, of which they are trying to disprove. Their argument results into what is called a reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity. Therefore, the principle of finality, which teaches that all things are ordered towards certain ends or goals, is necessarily true. Therefore, things are so constituted as to act for certain ends that are natural to them. For this is nothing more than the natural law. As Jacques Maritain writes, "The same applies for natural objects. Any kind of thing existing in nature, a plant, a dog, a horse, has its own natural law, that is, the normality of its functioning, the proper way in which, by reason of its specific structure and specific ends, it should achieve fullness of being either in its growth or in its behavior." As was said, the natural law of existing things is really just the proper ordering of a thing's nature. When a nature achieves a final end, it is achieving a higher perfection or mode of being. When a nature which is not rational, as for example a heart, achieves a final end, it has only a metaphysical meaning. For example, a heart that pumps blood and thus fulfills its final end is a good heart. Similarly, a heart that does not achieve its final end of pumping blood is thus a bad heart, but of course not with the moral sense of the word, good or bad. On the other hand, this idea of good takes on a moral meaning with mankind, as because man has a free will, and can choose to fulfill an end of his or not. For example, man can choose to eat food, and thus preserve his being, or he can choose to go against this end, and thus not preserve his being. In the latter case, man commits an evil by choice, since he acts contrary to his nature. From here, then, it can be established that because man has a choice in the natural law of his nature, this law becomes a type of moral law. We can now begin to establish a kind of moral guide from this idea of the good and the evil, for by natural inclination we tend toward the good, i.e. our final ends, and we try to avoid that which is contrary toward the good, which is evil. The primary precept, or guide of the natural law, is therefore that the good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. All other moral laws follow forth from this primary principle. For example, we ought to choose to eat food, because by it we achieve the final end of preserving our health or existence. By choosing to eat food, we are pursuing the good, and acting in accordance with the natural law. As was stated, if we so choose to not achieve this final end, then we would be acting contrary to our nature, and thus committing a moral evil. Now, if the primary precept is to pursue the good and avoid evil, the secondary precepts are therefore based on this primary precept. St. Thomas identifies 3 of these secondary precepts. The first is to preserve our being or existence, for all things in reality have an inclination to stay in reality. And for mankind, this would involve making sure we survive, and therefore one can think of eating healthy, working out, and getting good sleep. All of these ends are ordered toward the idea of preserving our life or existence. Another secondary precept is the inclination that we have to reproduce, bring forth offspring, and then educate them. Finally, the last secondary precept that St. Thomas identifies is the inclination that man has to know the truth about God, i.e. that he exists, and further that we should live in a society with other men. Man's nature more greatly flourishes living in a society, since an individual man, by himself, is not able to do all the things necessary for him in the long run. And therefore, because man naturally lives in a society, this society must be well ordered and constructed, lest it fall into destruction. The manner to keep this society well ordered is to consider the common good of all. The common good of society is how that society is able to flourish and be fruitful. And thus, for example, police officers are necessary for the common good of society, since they are able to create order where there is evil. To give a brief summary, it is self-evident that all things have order and purpose instilled within them as natures, according to the principle of finality. The proper ordering of a nature, or how that nature should act, is the natural law of that nature. This natural law becomes a moral natural law within humans because of our ability to choose between the good and the evil. And so if we want our nature to flourish, we ought to pursue the good which is in accordance with our nature, rather than evil which acts contrary to our nature. One final consideration to keep in mind is that this system of natural law does not leave out God, as if this is some kind of secular system of ethics. The natural law only acts in virtue of God, who is the sustainer of reality itself. God thus is the designer of creation and instills these final ends through our natures. The natural law, therefore, reflects the eternal law of God, since it is in the eternal law that we find God's providential plan for creation and how he orders all things. As St. Thomas writes, it is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. Thus, it becomes evident that there is an objective moral or ethical system that holds true for humanity. This objective moral system is found in that of the natural law, which man can come to know by his reason. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and if you want to help support my work, consider sending in a donation through the links in the description below. As always, God bless.